Hey, welcome everybody. I think we've got a few people joining. We'll wait just a minute or two more. Hopefully you can hear me all. If you can't, let me know.
So, just probably, I think we kind of using webinar, so only panelists can talk. Probably next time we should switch to a Zoom meeting. For kind of this time, we probably can.
Yeah, we're still kind of working out some of the kinks of the best way to do that. So for now, we may, if you want to use either the chat and the Q&A, and I posted that document there. And if you want to ask questions that way, and hopefully that will work out. Sorry, we'll just wait one more minute here to kind of give everybody a chance to join. And as mentioned, if you didn't see, there is a doc that I posted in the open source channel. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please feel free to use that link to, use that document to add any questions you might have, and we'll get into it in just 1 minute here. All right. And CJ, were you going to post the YouTube streaming link?
Yes, I just posted there.
Oh, I see, in the thread. Okay. All right. Well, we'll get started here, and if anybody else joins, we're happy to take any more questions. Like I said, apologies, right? We probably should have just done this as a normal Zoom meeting, but we also wanted to live stream it, so we're still figuring out kind of the best way to do some of that. So we'll kind of get started with just answering some questions today. So, but first off, thanks for joining, everybody. We're going to do this monthly. This will be a forum just for kind of to ask questions, dig into topics that you want to discuss, and discuss in depth any issues you may have or any questions. And we'll make sure to cover a broad range of topics over this. Once again, this will be recorded, so if there's something you want to refer back to, this will be recorded and posted on YouTube. And so first off, I'll kind of give an introduction to myself. So my name's Addison Hyam. I have been part of the Pulsar community for about 2 years. So just to kind of give you guys some background, I worked at a company called Instructure previously, where we adopted Pulsar, used that for some pretty large scale use cases and some interesting things like change data capture, etc. And really fell in love with the software, and kind of got involved in the community and decided to join StreamNative. And my job here is to really work with you in the community and make sure that we're doing kind of on being able to help answer questions and also help improve Pulsar for new features, new use cases, etc. So yeah, glad to be here today and glad to have so many of you here to ask some questions. So we'll kind of get just kicked it off with the first question that Frank has there. And that is, what is the difference between a durable and a non-durable subscription? In the non-durable case, how long after the consumer is closed does the subscription get terminated or expire? That's a good question. So, maybe the best way to think about this, and I'll share some docs here or share my screen, and we can look at the docs a bit. So one of the things to remember about Pulsar is that there are non-persistent subscriptions, and so this is a good way to think about this. Let me find where these are at. There we go. That's the doc I want. So in Pulsar, and this is going to seem a little bit around a way, but it'll kind of make sense in a minute here. When we're talking about non-persistent subscriptions, and non-persistent topics, basically what that means is that we're not writing that data to BookKeeper. So BookKeeper is basically, our reliable storage here. I'll close this. And in BookKeeper, if we decide not to basically bypass BookKeeper, we obviously get some performance improvement in the case of a non-persistent topic, right? Since we're not writing that to persistent storage, it ends up being quite a bit more performant and sending lots of messages. But obviously there's a downside there in the sense that a large downside in the sense that those messages aren't durably stored. They're not guaranteed to be stored anywhere. So a non-durable subscription is a very similar concept, right? In Pulsar, subscriptions are persisted to BookKeeper, and that allows you to say, okay, if my broker crashes and that subscription, I need to reconnect later, I'm still going to pick up that subscription because it's being stored in BookKeeper. And so that's what allows you to have some of these guarantees, like at least once delivery. That's part of the durability of the subscription, is what does that. But the reason why you may want a non-durable subscription and why it sort of exists is that it's really great for these cases where the reader is really controlling the offset. So I already kind of alluded to that via the reader API, where we create subscriptions that say, hey, I don't actually want you, Pulsar, to really be driving where I'm reading from. I'm going to control my offsets into the topic, and I'm going to use that mechanism to sort of control my position as opposed to Pulsar doing it. And then we don't really need that durable subscription. So that's kind of the main reason why that exists. And that's kind of what the reader API uses. So essentially the reader API that you've probably seen in the client documentation, that uses a non-durable subscription. And it sort of mentions here that because it's a non-durable subscription, they don't retain any data, and you don't actually use acknowledgements even. And so then to your second part of your question there, Frank, is about in the non-durable case, how long after the consumer is closed does the subscription get terminated or expire? In that case, the subscription lifetime is basically the same as a normal subscription. It's just only in the case of a crash that subscription will get deleted. So you can still unsubscribe. So use the Pulsar admin, the Pulsar admin unsubscribe feature to delete that subscription eagerly. But the only guarantee about when that subscription will go away or get terminated is just if there's a crash of a broker, that subscription state will be lost. And feel free to let me know in chat if that, Frank, if that kind of answers your question, if that gives you a sense of how that's supposed to work, or if you have any follow-ups, feel free to put that in the chat. Okay, that sounds like that answered Frank's question there. So kind of the next question here from, hopefully I'm getting the name right, is Ty. How can a producer application supply an Avro schema that is identical to the Avro schema uploaded by the Pulsar admin API? I think this is a conversation kind of coming from the open source Slack. In general, I'd say in asking, maybe it might sense to continue that conversation in the Slack channel there. But yeah, essentially the other option that exists there is there are some mechanisms that exist for you to have more control over the schema usage and whatnot. And that's maybe something that we can dig into in the in the open source Slack. But just for some context for everybody, you know, when you're using Pulsar schema and you're uploading a schema prior to, like if you're trying to do that with the APIs, and then you try and do that with when Pulsar automatically registers a schema, you kind of need to make sure that those two schemas match or at least compatible. And there can be some slight variances in different ways of how that Avro schema gets generated. And so it's kind of it's like something that can be a bit tricky as the kind of the problem that Ty is running into here, of how to kind of get started with that. But yeah, that's probably best to pick up in the next Slack. And so let me know, Ty. We can chat more after, but let me know if that kind of makes sense for now. And then kind of the next question here is from Alexander about benefits over Kafka, and questions about getting started with Pulsar for Kafka users. It's a great question. One we get, you know, there's a lot of questions about this, and I'll kind of give. So first off, you know, by no means Kafka is a great technology. You know, it has a lot of use cases. And there's a lot of, oops, sorry, I'm going to go to blog, that's StreamNative blog. And, you know, but there's a few things that if you're looking at Pulsar, one of the first things that we actually always talk about is that in many ways, you know, Pulsar is quite a different system in the sense that sort of the background of what it was trying to solve is quite a bit different. So Pulsar was initially, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to post this. You know, there's always questions about, we have a fair number of blog posts on talking more about like Pulsar and Kafka. One thing I wanted to talk about was, you know, this blog post, which I'll just share in chat here, that kind of talks in depth about, you know, from performance perspective, some of the differences there. But once again, kind of from a feature perspective, we often will say that Pulsar is a superset of Kafka features, right? So Kafka is really designed to be this append-only log that can really scale out and do that at scale. And while that's true of Pulsar, well, it can do those same things. Pulsar's actually API is more designed around a pure pub/sub API. So, you know, for background, Pulsar was initially developed at Yahoo to replace traditional JMS messaging systems, but to really do that at scale. So one way to think about Pulsar, and so kind of the needs, sorry, I should back up. The needs that then evolved out of that as Yahoo developed it was really about more core messaging APIs. So things like being able to do work queues that, you know, are very JMS typical things, as well as fan out, you know, large numbers of topics. And the way that Pulsar is really can be thought of is it's sort of built on top of the same similar internals of a, you know, scale out append only log, but then on top of that is sort of designed Pulsar's APIs for messaging and whatnot. And so I'd say that's one of first, like the biggest differences is that from an API perspective, there's a kind of a lot more to what Pulsar can do, like individual acknowledgements, shared subscriptions, large numbers of topics, etc. And then kind of to get into maybe some of the biggest differences that we see more on the operational side is that, you know, Pulsar is a rebalance-free architecture. So through the use of BookKeeper, that means that there's not some of these same concerns that exist with Kafka around like needing to rebalance storage if you want to scale up your cluster, or needing to, if, you know, in the case of failure into like replacing a node, that you have to sort of re-replicate all that data over. And so we really kind of, one way we say that is we say that Pulsar is cloud native. It's really designed for being able to like add new capacity and quickly make use of it. And then as far as tutorials or guides for Kafka developers, I'm trying to think of there's definitely some blog posts. I don't know if StreamNative has any content targeted directly towards like sort of Pulsar for Kafka developers. But typically the way to get started with Pulsar is just to kind of get used to its model, since its model is quite a bit different of being able to use sort of the producer and consumer APIs. And if you're looking to sort of replicate the most similar to like a Kafka consumer group is a failover subscription, right? So that's kind of the semantics there for Kafka users. And if there anybody else, this is also not just entirely me, or this is just not entirely me talking the whole time. If anybody else has any of the resources that you've used, if you're coming from Kafka, that are helpful, please feel free to share those. Those are always appreciated as well. Yeah, thank you, CJ. CJ just posted a link in the channel of a Pulsar for Kafka people that really kind of gives a good overview of how some of those things translate. But we don't have anything much in the docs, and maybe that's something that we can improve as just a document to kind of cover that. All right. Hopefully, Alexander, that helps. Let me know if there's any more follow-up you want there. All right. So moving on to kind of the next question there from Ty again here is, how can we hard delete all the schema versions from a topic? So that basically the problem being here is that when you do the delete, the Pulsar admin delete, it does a soft delete, and when a producer reconnects, it will kind of use those old versions. Whereas if it does auto topic deletion, so where a topic is deleted, that picks it back up. So there's another API call. Oh, you are doing that. I'm actually not. That's a good question. I'm actually not sure on this one. I don't know, CJ, if you have anything to add on to
sure.
that.
So I think for the schema deletion, it should be so we don't support delete individual version. So when you delete a schema, it will actually delete all the existing version. What it does is it will just write a timestamp in the schema ledger. But when you try to recreate the schema again, the previous schema version should not exist anymore. But there might be, I'm not sure what version that you're using. I know in 2.4, 2.5, there's certain, there are some bugs around like schema deletion. And if it's Pulsar like 270, I wouldn't expect that would be the behavior. So it sounds like a strange behavior. So if you have any use cases, any like program is able to kind of reproduce that behavior, please let's create a GitHub issue, and then we can like follow up on what would be the right behavior. But the expectation is when there was a deletion happen, all the previous schema versions should be deleted.
And this may be, I mean, it's possible that there's some eventual consistency there. So if you did it in a really tight loop, maybe that would be slightly different. But
there's one possibility that we're coming up is right now is the deletion itself is done separately from deleting the old data. So if you have, if you delete the schema, but it doesn't actually delete the old version. So which means that if you're referencing, if you still having, if there are still old data referencing the old schema version, there might be potential that you will still get those schema information. But ideally, that shouldn't be. You shouldn't be able to kind of access the schema through new producer, new consumer, or even new, even via the Pulsar admin API. So that sounds like a buggy like behavior. So we have to do that. Yeah.
Good question though. Definitely one of those things to kind of dig in there and understand from our side and see if there's some strange behavior there. Cool. We'll engage more about that in Slack and GitHub and whatnot. And then Daniel asks, what's the minimal broker config for OAuth 2 client implementation? And thanks, Jared, for joining. And yeah, as you guys will have a recording of this. So if you weren't able to stay for the whole thing, we'll post the recording so you can follow back up for any other questions you had. But getting back to this question, the minimal broker config for an OAuth 2 client implementation. Is it possible to set up, and there's kind of some configuration here. Is it possible to set up a standalone Pulsar for OAuth 2? The standalone config appears to lack the token public key field. Cool. Yeah. So, and this kind of gets into the intricacy of OAuth 2 versus sort of OIDC. So you'll notice in the there is a different authentication provider that's called authentication provider OAuth 2, and that is a relatively new addition. Sorry, I'm trying to remember, what is it called?
Maybe I can take the question because I know, I think I deal with that kind of interaction on the Slack.
Okay.
So for OAuth 2, the right now in the open source side, there's only OAuth 2 client provider, so you can use the OAuth 2 client authentication. On OAuth 2 provider on the client side. In the server side, what you need to do is what Daniel posted in the doc is you need to use the token provider with the public key getting from your OAuth 2 issuer. You can use that to kind of verify the token that is sent by the OAuth 2 client provider. And I think the question is about, is it possible to set up a standalone Pulsar for OAuth 2? Yes. The question, so the answer is yes. So there's no difference between running Pulsar broker in a cluster mode versus the standalone mode. The only difference is the cluster mode. The broker itself would use a broker.conf for starting the broker. And when you're running on standalone mode, and the standalone mode that it would using a standalone conf, but the standalone conf probably doesn't have all the settings available, but you can just copy those settings that you used in the broker conf to standalone.conf, and it should work. Because there's no difference between like running a broker in a standalone mode and versus running a broker in cluster mode. The only difference is that the config file that you're using is different. But if you copy those settings to standalone conf, it should work.
Yes. So yeah, even though you may not see that key or that configuration value in the standalone.conf, all of the same fields that are valid in the broker.conf should be valid in the standalone.conf. If you don't see that respected, open an issue, let us know. But mostly you should be able to just sort of take some of those same values into the standalone.conf. Hopefully, I could get the standalone to run with that config. I assumed it failed because of the missing public key in the standalone fields. Maybe this is another good one to kind of just share in the open source or in the Slack channel. If there's some questions there, we can dig into that and see why that might not be starting. That's a good question.
Yeah,
I was just go ahead.
I think if you I probably understand the question is that if the token public key is not added to the standalone.conf and you try to specify the authentication provider with token provider, then when you try to restart the broker, I think it will fail, but the error messages probably don't give you enough information. what you can probably do is just a copy, just add token public key and token auth claim at the end of your standalone conf file, and try to kind of start the standalone again. And if you encounter any issues, we're happy to kind of engage in the Slack channel to help you solve the issue.
Yeah. Good question though. Another question from Ty here. After my laptop powers off while Pulsar standalone is running, I try to run Pulsar standalone again, but Pulsar standalone is unable to start the HTTP service. I changed the services local. Okay, so I guess one question, Ty, is when you're doing, so this is a problem where it looks like you have multiple Pulsars running at the same time. So when you say you're power off, that's like you're stopping the Pulsar standalone process. Okay, laptop runs out of power. Maybe because it's going into like a sleep mode, but what I would look for is see if you see another process that's nothing's listed on port 88. I was going to say if you used to like LSOF, that's interesting. I can't think of any reason why that would be the case if you don't see anything running. It's possible that if you look and you see if you had like if you can use like your PS or look at your, through top or whatever to see if there's a latent Pulsar process and see if you can kind of kill that and see if that fixes it. But otherwise, once the Pulsar standalone process is killed, it should hang up and allow you to use 8080 again. Other than that, it seems like somewhat of a weird one. We're not doing anything different or special there. Mostly this is Pulsar starts up and then starts a Netty server on that port. And killing the Java process should stop the port. Obviously, if something else kills the Java process, it should hang up. But maybe there may be some issue where when it goes into sleep mode, that Java process doesn't properly, give up on the port or something. Maybe put the socket into like a weird state. So I would definitely look and see if you get in that state again, if you can, see if there's a like some Pulsar process that's not didn't get killed properly, is like maybe hanging around. And if that still doesn't fix it, then that might be a question sort of OS weirdness. I mean, obviously like a reboot should fix that, like a proper reboot, but yeah, not sure beyond that. Hopefully that gives you some direction though. And rebooting does not fix the problem. Okay. Yeah, if you want to share, it sounds like you have some logs. It'd be great we can kind of look at that and see if there's anything obvious there. But yeah, that seems like a strange one. And then Ty's one more question here about, I think more process of asking in Slack first before filing GitHub issues. Good question. I think, there's certainly a lot of value if you're trying to ascertain if something is a bug, if you're not sure. Slack's a great place to ask. And then, but by no means, is that required? I think what we really appreciate, what's great in the community, as long as you can kind of search in GitHub issues first and see if you find, another thread. But beyond that, asking questions via GitHub issues, if it looks like a bug and you've got some sense that something may be a bug or, something that's not clear in the documentation, those all make sense as issues. But, feel free to also use the Slack channel to, ask any clarification questions. And if something feels like it might be a bug, we're always kind of happy to try and give some advice and guidance there. And usually can be helpful, a faster process to kind of pin down whether something is in fact a bug. So hopefully that gives you a good answer. I don't know, CJ, if you wanted to add anything to that.
So I just should add kind of more thought is if it's related to like unknown behavior, you feel there might be a bug, then like posting question in Slack is probably a good way to kind of engage with the community first. But for some of the questions that might be related to some of the concepts is not clear, which I would recommend, if possible, please help create Stack Overflow questions. And we are happy, and then just you post the link in the Slack channel. We're happy to answer those questions in Stack Overflow. One of the reasons for that is if we get the question in Stack Overflow, it would help us. It will help get those questions being indexed by Google search. So then people, if the people have similar question in the future, they can find the answers in through Google search. So that is kind of the
great
yeah.
Great idea. I mean, that's something, I apologize, I should have thought of that myself. That's something that we're trying to work on, that is kind of an effort in the communities to try and get more stuff in Stack Overflow where it's a little bit better indexed. So and then obviously, you know, if there's things that aren't clear and requires doc improvements, I know that's a oftentimes another things where concepts aren't clear, we try and, you know, improve the docs. All right, so I'll move on to the next question here from Anton. How Pulsar manages large messages. And then there's pip37, which we can pull up here and show what that is in a little more detail. Talk a little bit about how that works. But first, kind of to answer the question is, there's multiple ways you can handle large messages. And I'll kind of give you 3 options of how we sort of recommend this. So the first one is, if you just have slightly larger messages, you know, say that, so the default message size in Pulsar max message size is 5 megabytes. If you need, you know, maybe it's 10 megabytes, maybe it's just something a little bit small or a little bit bigger than that 5 megabyte size, you can change the default max message size, and it requires basically setting 2 settings. One is, and I'll pull this up as well so we can. So there's a setting here called max message size. That's one of the settings you need to send. And then in BookKeeper, there's also a setting called Netty max frame size bytes. So those 2 settings together both need to be set, and that can then raise your max message size a little bit. And I would say that, you know, that's a really great solution if you just occasionally have some of these large messages that you just want to be able to handle and have it kind of be very transparent. That's not going to cause like super bad performance problems, but it's also really not ideal for saying, hey, I'm constantly moving like 6 or 7 megabyte chunks or whatever. You know, that's kind of a different beast in terms of what the performance implications of that are. So that kind of then leads into the second option, which is the pip37. And pip37 is transparent to the client. And what pip37 does is it basically just breaks your message up into multiple chunks that then get reassembled on the consumer. So the producer will get, you know, the stream of bytes. It'll split it into as many chunks as it needs, and then the consumer will rebuild that message out of the various small chunks. That's a really useful way, particularly when you're dealing more with consistent volumes of large messages, and the performance is still going to be quite good. So because we're splitting up that message into smaller chunks, there's going to be some extra latency because you're going to be, you know, breaking up the message and then reassembling it on the other side, and we have to wait for all those different chunks to arrive. But there's not really much of a huge performance impact. It's mostly going to be pretty similar, the same amount of throughput, just with some latency hit. for that reassembly process. There is one kind of, I don't know if it's necessarily gotcha, but thing to keep in mind there is that you can't use, is that, well, first, I don't think the chunking support is across all the clients yet. I believe it's in both, it's obviously, it's in Java, and I think it's also implemented in C++. I don't believe it's yet implemented in the Pulsar client Go yet. And so there is some work there depending on your client needs. And then there's also one more sort of caveat there, is that say you have a mixture of large messages and small messages. When you enable that chunking feature, it actually disables batching. So typically it's probably not the best idea to like intermix when you're trying to use that chunking with maybe some use case of lots of small messages. So that's kind of the only real gotcha there. With from the perspective of how you may design your topics. And there's also one other thing to consider, is that it only is used, can only be supported in exclusive subscription, or I think exclusive and failover modes. So that's, you know, because we're like reassembling them, we have to have that strong ordering guarantee. So these large messages do not work with a shared subscription. And so I mentioned those two techniques. And then I want to bring up sort of a third technique. And what I would say is that if you have some large messages that kind of can have an unbounded size, there and it just may happen periodically and whatnot. Another really nice technique is to use a claim check pattern. And that's basically where you might write that message, you might persist that message to some other place, you know, maybe it's S3, similar cloud storage. And then instead in your message body, send just a reference to that larger message. That's not anything, there's no like support for that natively in Pulsar clients or anything, but that claim check pattern can be a very useful way to sort of model some of those things if you have even particularly like very large messages, like if you have use cases where you might end up having, you know, I'll bring up one that is pretty common, is if you're doing change data capture. You know, change data capture most of the time is probably going to be very relatively reasonable sized messages, but maybe you have one table that can appear occasionally have like very large payloads. You know, like a claim check pattern is a really nice way to do that, because you still want batching. You still want to be able to have the ability to handle lots of small messages, but you just may occasionally have these very large messages so chunking is not a good idea. You know, having to raise your max message size to like 50 megabytes is not a good idea. That claim check pattern is a great solution for that. Hopefully that gives you a good sense of where to go there. You know, feel free to ask any follow-ups. Next question here from Daniel. Do you have any plans to support a Pulsar Kubernetes operator? So here's this one from that I think has been done in the community, but yeah, as at this point, I don't know how much actively it's being worked on. That's a great question. I will say that so internally at StreamNative, we're working on operators. We have our StreamNative cloud hosted offering is powered by some Kubernetes operators. There's still kind of evaluation of how and when we would open source those, or put them more as like a community, maybe not be fully open source, but with some community access to those. And so those are great questions. I think you're kind of right on you know, being able to scale by CPU, memory, etc. is something that fits well in an operator, and something that we kind of have some thoughts and designs around. And I should say that if you're interested in, you know, please reach out about the operators, and this goes for kind of anybody in the channels. If you really have some interest in that, you know, please feel free to reach out to us, the StreamNative team, and we can kind of discuss about maybe some options to try some of those out. That is something we're trying to kind of you know, further evolve, but it's just not a super easy thing to just open source. There's lots of details there. So hopefully that gives you a good sense. But yeah, that's definitely something that we see and kind of have plans for trying to improve in the community. And particularly for features like that. I should also mention on the auto scaling side, there's kind of two aspects to auto scaling with a system like this. There's both auto scaling of the underlying cluster. There's also auto scaling of kind of the topics themselves, right? Like I need more partitions for my throughput. There's also some early plans, discussions about how that might be supported. And if that's something you're interested in, we'd actually love to kind of get some feedback on that. So, please feel free once again, if that's something that would be really useful for your use case, reach out to us and we can maybe have some chats around what that, trying to gather requirements. And that's one of the things that, is always useful is people who need certain things and we can gather requirements from there. Let me know if that hopefully, we can talk in the open source. Frank, I've watched several the BookKeeper talks from CJ, which were very helpful. I'd like to learn about the broker usage of the Bookie client and how this API works. Any recommendations? That's a good question. I don't know, CJ, if you have any other resources. I know you have the one blog post that you may want to link, but.
So I think we can probably have one workshop, one an hour introduction about BookKeeper and how Pulsar use BookKeeper and maybe a bit kind of internal. We can plan some of the workshop or sessions around that. Just similarly, what we are doing next week is we are going to have a monthly kind of free training around introduction to Pulsar. We can probably considering producing similar content about introduction to BookKeeper and how Pulsar would be using BookKeeper, so then everyone would have a better concept. So I would take an action item and have a conversation with our team, our training team, and to see if we can produce some of, we can organize some of the sessions or produce any kind of the materials for that.
And CJ, do you have the one blog posts that I think they're a little bit older now? I think there's maybe one or two blog posts that would be interesting if you wanted to share.
Yeah, I know so we do have some kind of internal write-up in terms of like how BookKeeper works and how Pulsar use BookKeeper and how that how the way BookKeeper works is related to how a raft consensus algorithm or replication algorithm works. So we do have some of the content. We can convert those content into blog posts to make it available to the public community.
Cool.
These are action items that we need to take and outside. Yeah.
I was thinking of that Medium blog post that I think written like a year and a half ago that has some information about that.
Okay. We can discuss about the content and then try to come up with a series content about that.
Great. And then, we can also in these office hours, depending on how many questions there are, if there's any more time left, you can spend maybe a minute or two kind of looking at some of that. But and then there was a question from Ty, questions about so the API docs for the schema class here. Is there similar documentation for the schema definition? I assume you may be talking about the Avro. So the schema definitions in Pulsar are pretty much, in the case of Avro, are basically
that is actually a good question. I'm not sure why the schema definition class was not generated in the API.
Is it not there?
Yeah, it sounds like the schema definition is not generated.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
That is probably a Java doc generation problem, and we didn't notice before. Actually, 1 second. That might be an old version, so give me one.
Oh, that's correct. So there's sort of one sharp edge here with the doc website that what Google chooses to index is sort of painful sometimes. So the best place to go to always get to the latest version of the docs is through right here. And then
Yes,
from
correct.
there, there should now be the schema definition there. So I'll, and then there's the more specific link there. But yeah, so if you're searching through Google for whatever reason, rather than totally get 404s, but it still for some reason is preferring to surface a much older version of the API docs. And so that's always, if you see something a little bit strange, always recommended to just go to the doc website, excuse me, and click through the latest version of the package there. Yeah, hopefully that helps. Oh yeah, I can show you again where that is under the clients here, and then under the Java client. All of the docs for each of these should link to the respective generated documentation. Let's see, so it's a little bit different, but all of these should have links to the respective generated documentation. And so under clients, Java, and then just clicking the package name will take you to the latest version of the Java docs. Cool. So, I mean, I'm happy to take any more questions, but I also can dig a little bit into talking. Just, I have some slides I can share a little bit about talking about a broad overview of BookKeeper with the last 10 minutes, if there's interest. Anything else anybody wants to chat today? You can also feel free to ask questions in the, I'll stop my share here. I don't see anything in the Q&A section here or in the chat. Any final questions for the last couple minutes of time here? And then otherwise I'll dig into some. Yeah, so the scaling Pulsar section, I'll dig into that. One question about, digging in a little bit into scaling Pulsar. So give me 1 second, I'll pull up. I should have been a little bit more prepared to bring this up. Give me 1 second. I have this open, but there's lots of slides here, so it takes a few minutes for all the slides to load. All right, I will share my screen here again. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about kind of, this did take a little bit into both how BookKeeper works and how Pulsar, scale Pulsar. One of the big challenges when you're dealing with streaming systems is IO contention, right? Ultimately, when we're trying to write a lot of data to persist it to a disk, right? We have lots of different streams potentially. That's a challenging problem. So just to kind of give an idea here, right? Like if we're just writing a single large stream to some underlying storage, that's relatively straightforward. But that gets more complex as we maybe have lots of different streams that we're trying to deal with. And then when we add things like, we're now doing some tailing reads, that becomes, once again, we're asking more of this kind of IO subsystem to take care of. Some of that stuff can be kind of done quite easily. For example, here, introducing a cache into the equation can, take off some of the read load so we can really focus still on, writing these streams. But ultimately, when we start getting into a situation where now we're also into to try and read old data, we're doing what we call a catch-up read, where we're further behind in a stream. That's a very challenging thing for any single I/O subsystem to do. And so this kind of gets a little bit into BookKeeper, and we can talk a little bit about how BookKeeper works internally, and then we can talk about how this sort of impacts the scaling of Pulsar. So, with BookKeeper, the way that we're able to really handle all of these different needs in a streaming system is BookKeeper has some really nice design around being able to make it so that there's different tiers for each one of those tasks. And so this diagram here kind of shows that. So in Pulsar, when we're doing writes, we actually have two different pools of disk, the journal disk and what we call the ledger disk. And when we're doing a write path into Pulsar, these writes, the only place they need to hit to be persisted before we acknowledge is this journal disk. So we f-sync to that journal disk, meaning we've guaranteed it's persisted, but we also write the data into a write cache. And then that write cache periodically gets flushed to our ledger disk. Then in the case of the crash, we can replay this journal, rebuild our write cache, and then flush, and that's how we get consistency. But that means that writes only have to hit our journal in the fast path, and then we also have this write cache that makes it so that we get the most recent data when we're doing reads, but it's not our reads are not hitting our journal disk. So the journal disk is only really concerned with handling the write load initially, and then this ledger disk does not have to be as fast. And so that means when we're doing these catch-up reads, there's sort of two things that happen here. One is that disk is not also having to handle like a really high throughput amount of writes. It's sort of somewhat isolated in that perspective. But we also make use of doing read ahead pre-filling our cache. So because we're reading sequential data, you read one record, it's pretty easy thing for us to sort of assume that you're going to read the next record. And so we pre-fill that cache. And so that combination of things means that, kind of going back to this here, is that we're actually using two different disks for writes versus some of these catch-up reads. So what that means is that when you're trying to write to Pulsar, when you're trying to scale Pulsar, there's lots of different ways you may scale Pulsar. So if you're trying to get more throughput purely on the write side, the real important thing to think about here is making sure you're kind of scaling the right component. So if you're trying to really, once again, have high throughput, that faster BookKeeper disk, particularly on the journal disk, is going to be kind of the biggest bottleneck there, assuming that how you have sufficient CPU and memory for a given capacity. And so there's sort of vertical scaling that can be done with Pulsar, faster BookKeeper disks, et cetera. But also, because we kind of have, a larger pool of storage that we can spread these things across, you also can add more bookies to support more throughput. So those are kind of the biggest things if you're trying to support writes is either faster disks and bigger bookies or more bookies. But ultimately, you want to make sure you're kind of getting that fastest journal disk you can. But because of Pulsar's design, if you're trying to do maybe more read throughput, right, like where maybe you're doing a lot of fan out, where you're taking one set of relatively small data, maybe it's 10 megabytes a second of data on the input side, but then you're fanning that 10 megabits out of data, megabits per second, I should say, of data to 30 consumers. So now you suddenly have a ton of read capacity and a lot of fan out. Well, both because of this read caching that exists, this in-memory read cache, as well as caching that's actually done in the broker layer, you really don't necessarily need to scale up your disk a lot if those are tailing reads. Instead, you can really focus on just having a bigger broker that can sort of fan that out to to more consumers. And there also can be uses of like a partition topic there to make sure that you're can have that partition topic run across multiple brokers and make use of kind of horizontally scaling across those multiple brokers. And so I don't have quite enough time to probably dig into this as deep as it might be needed today, and some we can kind of pick up next week. But really, maybe the summary for today is that depending on how you're looking to scale Pulsar, there's no sort of one size fits all solution of, oh, just add more memory here or more CPU here. And while that does mean that there's some complexity, that also means that you can often be very efficient in how you scale Pulsar. There's no need to sort of, if you're just trying to store, to do that fan out of data, there's no need to like also scale up your BookKeeper tier to be, massively large or something. That often can be just meant by scaling your broker tier out. And so once again, that's something we can probably dig into more through another one of these, or if anybody has follow-up questions. And then, there's some other aspect to that is like knowing when to scale. Once again, probably not enough time to sort of cover that here today, but the Pulsar has pretty good metrics, and there's a few key things you can look at of kind of seeing when it, indicating when it's time to scale. And maybe that would be a great thing for us to pick up next week, since I won't have time to cover that in depth today. So thanks everybody for coming in and asking some good questions. Hopefully that was gave you some good answers, and I think kicked off some more conversations to hopefully please reach out in the open source Slack, and also let us know about this format. What can we do better to make sure that we're you feel like you can engage with us and the community really well, and if there's anything else that if we need to do this more often or something along those lines, we're happy to kind of try and engage and see what makes sense for making sure that you can ask and answer questions. But before I kind of end this and say goodbye, any last few questions or any thoughts from anybody? If you just want to put it in the chat. All right. Well, if not, then thank you everybody for your time today. We'll pick this up again next month. Again,